Tonight, we revisit one case that became part of British memory. One life, one investigation, one record that has remained open in the historical archive for more than 100 years. The case of Martha Tabram begins in Whitechapel in the East End of London in the summer of 1888. Whitechapel at that time was one of the most densely populated districts in England, situated within the metropolitan borough of Stepney and forming part of the broader East End that stretched eastward from the City of London along both sides of the Thames. The population of Whitechapel and the surrounding parishes numbered in the hundreds of thousands, crowded into a district of tight-packed tenements, back courts and covered passages, of market stalls along the high street and garment workshops in the side alleys, of public houses at every corner and pawnbrokers operating freely in the streets between them. The principal thoroughfares were gas-lit to a degree that permitted movement at night, but the side courts, covered passages and communal staircases of the tenement blocks were largely dark once the evening had advanced. The workforce of the district was casual and precarious. Dock labourers attended the morning calls at the gates of the London docks in the hope of a day's engagement. Factory hands were employed at the match and leather works on irregular terms. Garment sewers worked long hours in the sweated trade of the Jewish immigrant quarter. A substantial portion of the district's population obtained what income it could by less formal means. George Yard, the site at the centre of this case, was a narrow covered passage running between Whitechapel High Street and Wentworth Street. George Yard Buildings, which stood within that passage, was a block of model dwellings, constructed with the stated aim of providing improved accommodation for working-class residents of the district and considered a step above the worst class of common lodging house in the area. Martha Tabram was born Martha White on the 10th of May, 1849, in Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames. Her father was Charles Samuel White, a warehouseman, and her mother was Elizabeth Dowsett White. The family was working class in its composition and circumstances, with the father's occupation placing the household among the skilled or semi-skilled labouring population of the district. Martha was the youngest of 5 children. The names and subsequent histories of her siblings do not survive in the documentary record with any completeness. Her childhood in Southwark was spent in an urban environment of considerable density, with limited economic prospects for children of her class and background. No formal educational record for Martha White has been identified in the surviving documents, which is consistent with the experience of the majority of working-class children in South London during the mid-Victorian decades. On Christmas Day, 1869, Martha White married Henry Samuel Tabram at Trinity Church, Newington, in Southwark. She was 20 years old at the time of the marriage. Henry Tabram was employed as a furniture packer. The marriage was conducted in the Anglican tradition and is recorded in the parish register of Trinity Church. The union produced 2 sons. No further documentation of the children's names or their subsequent lives appears in the records directly relevant to this case. The early years of the marriage are not documented in detail in the surviving record, though Henry Tabram's later testimony at the coroner's inquest offers some account of its course and its eventual deterioration. The marriage broke down over a period of years. Henry Tabram attributed the failure primarily to Martha's consumption of alcohol. Henry left the marital home in 1875. Following the separation, he agreed to pay Martha a maintenance allowance of 12 shillings per week, a sum consistent with the modest means of a working-class man in his position. This arrangement did not remain stable. Henry Tabram testified at the subsequent inquest that he had encountered Martha on the street in a state of intoxication at some point after the separation, and that he had subsequently reduced the maintenance payment to 2 shillings and 6pence per week. The exact date of this reduction is not established in the surviving record with full precision. From approximately 1876, Martha entered into a relationship with a man named Henry Turner, a carpenter described in some contemporary sources as also engaged in the furniture trade. During the period of this relationship, Martha used the name Emma Turner. She and Turner cohabited for a number of years. The relationship followed a course similar in its ending to the marriage, with Turner's eventual departure from the household attributed in the record to Martha's drinking. Turner left Martha at some point in the weeks or months prior to the summer of 1888, the precise date not established with certainty in the surviving record. At the time of her death, Martha was lodging at a common lodging house at 19 George Street, Spitalfields, a street later renamed Lolesworth Street. This establishment represented one of the lowest rungs of available accommodation in the East End, a class of housing in which beds were charged at 4p per night, and the residents were largely those without fixed employment or family support. Martha was 39 years old at the time of her death. She had no steady employment in the weeks preceding it, and she supported herself during that period through casual prostitution. Street prostitution in Whitechapel in 1888 was not a profession undertaken through economic choice. The Metropolitan Police estimated in 1888 that approximately 1,200 women were engaged in street prostitution in the Whitechapel district. Women in Martha's circumstances, separated from husbands, without marketable skills, and without family networks capable of providing material assistance, entered into prostitution as the means available to them of meeting the most basic daily expenses. The 4p required each night to secure a bed at a common lodging house set the practical floor of what such a woman needed to earn each day to avoid sleeping on the street. Martha's principal documented associate during this period was a woman named Mary Ann Connolly, known in the neighbourhood by the street name Pearly Pole. Connolly also lived in the area and was known to the local police. If you find value in histories preserved through court records, inquest testimony, and verified documentary evidence, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now back to the record. The 6th of August 1888 was a bank holiday Monday. The Bank Holidays Act of 1871 had established the first Monday of August as a public holiday, and the streets of the East End on such days took on a character distinct from the ordinary working week. Public houses remained open and were crowded through the afternoon and into the evening. Workers who had received their wages in the preceding days had disposable income available to them. The regular rhythms of dock labour and workshop employment were suspended for the day, and the population of the district moved more freely through the streets than was typical on working nights. Soldiers from the garrison at the Tower of London were a regular presence in the public houses along the Whitechapel High Street and in the streets of the surrounding district. It was in this context that Martha Tabram spent the evening of the 6th of August, 1888. Martha and Mary Ann Connolly went out together on the evening of the 6th. They were joined during the course of the evening by 2 soldiers, and the 4 spent a period of several hours drinking at public houses in the Whitechapel area. The establishments they visited that evening included the White Swan, situated on Whitechapel High Street, and at least one further public house in the vicinity of George Yard, identified in some accounts as the Angel and Crown. The sequence of establishments visited that evening is slightly inconsistent across the surviving testimonies, and the precise order in which they were attended cannot be determined from the available record with full confidence. The 4 individuals were in each other's company from approximately 10 o'clock in the evening and remained together through the late hours of the night. Martha and Connolly were known to each other from the district. The 2 soldiers were not identified by name in the investigation that followed, and their identities were never established by the authorities to a definitive standard. At approximately 1:45, the group separated. Mary Ann Connolly and her soldier companion parted from Martha and Martha's companion at or near the entrance to George Yard. Connolly and her companion went in a different direction. Martha and the unidentified soldier entered the covered passage of George Yard together. This separation was the last time Mary Ann Connolly saw Martha Tabram alive. The night of the 6th passed into the early hours of the 7th. Residents of George Yard buildings came and went through the communal staircase of the building during those hours. Joseph Mahoney, a resident, and his wife passed through the first floor landing at approximately 1:45 in the morning and noticed nothing on the landing and heard no disturbance of any kind. Alfred George Crowe, a waterside labourer and fellow resident of the building, passed the first-floor landing at approximately 3:30 in the morning. Crowe observed a figure lying on the landing. He took the figure to be a person sleeping, which was not an unusual enough sight in the East End to give him cause for alarm, and he continued on his way without stopping to examine the matter further. Whether the figure that Crowe observed at 3:30 in the morning was Martha Tabram still living, or Martha Tabram already dead, cannot be determined from the evidence available to the inquiry. The two accounts, Mahoney's at 1:45 and Crowe's at 3:30, together established a window within which the body was either deposited or remained undetected on the landing, and within which whatever occurred on that landing either was ongoing or had concluded. The condition of the first-floor landing at George Yard Buildings in the early hours of the 7th of August was not substantially distinguished from many other such spaces in the district during that period of the night. Communal landings in model dwellings in Whitechapel served, informally at times, as resting places for those without other shelter. The building was not illuminated throughout the night with any consistency. The passage of several residents through that landing in the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning without disturbance or alarm is a documented feature of the case and was noted formally at the subsequent inquest proceedings. The investigation that followed the discovery of Martha Tabram's body would draw in soldiers from two of the most prominent regiments of the British Army, produce two sets of identity parade proceedings at separate barracks, and generate a body of witness testimony that ultimately proved insufficient to bring any individual before a court. The case was reported widely in the London press. It attracted the attention of the Metropolitan Police at the divisional and senior level, and it concluded without resolution. What it set in motion in the weeks that followed would become something considerably larger than the inquiry into the death of one woman on a Whitechapel landing. At approximately 4:45 in the morning on Tuesday the 7th of August, 1888, John Saunders Reeves descended the communal staircase of George Yard Buildings on his way to seek work at the docks. Reeves was a dock labourer, accustomed to the early start that the morning call at the dock gates required. He came down from the upper floors of the building in the early grey light of an August dawn. On the first-floor landing, he found a woman lying on the ground in a pool of blood. Reeves did not attempt to examine the woman or to determine whether she was living. He went immediately to the street to find a police officer. Police Constable Thomas Barrett of H Division, Metropolitan Police, was on his beat in the vicinity of George Yard and Whitechapel High Street. He was flagged down by Reeves and directed to the building. Barrett entered George Yard Buildings and ascended to the first-floor landing. He found the woman there, lying on her back, in the condition Reeves had described. Barrett sent for a medical man immediately. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen, a surgeon practicing at 68 Brick Lane, Whitechapel, was called to the scene. He arrived at the landing at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning and examined the body. He confirmed that the woman was dead and that the cause of death was consistent with multiple stab wounds. The pool of blood beneath the body was substantial. Dr. Killeen ordered the body to be conveyed to the mortuary for formal post-mortem examination and remained at the scene to examine the immediate surroundings before that removal took place. The woman on the landing was not immediately identified. She was not carrying any documentation of her identity, and her appearance was not known to the first officers at the scene. The process of identifying her was conducted in the hours that followed the discovery, through inquiries at the lodging houses in the immediate area and through contact with the persons known to have been in her company on the preceding evening. Her identity was eventually confirmed through Henry Turner, who had cohabited with her until shortly before her death, and who came forward to the authorities to identify the body. Henry Samuel Tabram, her estranged husband, was also contacted and confirmed the identification. The woman on the first-floor landing of George Yard Buildings was Martha Tabram, aged 39, formerly of 19 George Street, Spitalfields. The discovery on the morning of the 7th of August, 1888, established that Martha Tabram was dead. It opened the question of how she had died and at whose hands which the investigation would now be required to address through formal inquiry. The investigation was formally opened by H Division, Metropolitan Police, under the direction of Inspector Edmund Reed, who served as the head of the Criminal Investigation Department for the division. H Division was responsible for Whitechapel and the surrounding area, and was among the most stretched of the Metropolitan Police's divisional commands, operating in a district with a large, transient, and economically precarious population that presented particular challenges for investigative work. Inspector Reed took charge of the inquiry and directed the gathering of evidence and the taking of witness statements in the hours and days that followed the discovery of the body. Officers were dispatched to conduct inquiries in the building and the immediate surrounding area. The residents of George Yard buildings were interviewed regarding what they had seen or heard during the night of the 6th and the early hours of the 7th. Joseph Mahoney and his wife both gave statements confirming that they had passed the first-floor landing at approximately 1:45 in the morning and had seen and heard nothing of any disturbance. Alfred George Crowe gave a statement to the effect that he had observed a figure lying on the landing at approximately 3:30 and had taken that figure to be sleeping. These two accounts together establish the earliest and latest points within which the body might plausibly have been either deposited or left undiscovered on the landing. The investigation turned in its first days upon the presence of two soldiers in Martha's company on the evening of the 6th. This thread was introduced by two separate sources. The first was Mary Ann Connolly, Pearly Poll, who had been Martha's companion throughout that evening, and who was the last known person to have seen Martha alive before she entered George Yard. The second was P.C. Thomas Barrett himself, who had an account of his own to give regarding a soldier he had encountered near George Yard in the early hours of the morning of the 7th. Barrett testified that at approximately 2:00 in the morning, on the 7th, he had observed a soldier standing in Wentworth Street, at the Whitechapel High Street end of George Yard. He had spoken briefly to the man and noted his appearance. The soldier wore the uniform of the Grenadier Guards. Barrett did not detain him, as there was at that point no reason to do so, and the man's presence in the street was not in itself irregular. Barrett recorded the soldier's description and later provided this account to the investigation. His encounter at 2:00 in the morning placed a Grenadier Guard near the mouth of George Yard, within the window during which Martha's death had been determined to have occurred. Connolly's evidence was more directly material. She had been present with Martha and the two soldiers through the evening. She confirmed that the group had separated at approximately 1:45 midnight, with Martha and one soldier entering George Yard, and Connolly and the other soldier proceeding in a different direction. She provided descriptions of both soldiers and stated that she believed them to be Coldstream Guards, identifying the distinctive white cap bands worn by that regiment as the basis for her identification. She did not provide the names of either man, as she had not known them. Connolly was evasive in the early stages of the investigation and did not come forward to the police immediately. Her cooperation with the inquiry was obtained over a period of several days, and she was noted by officers and later by press accounts as an unreliable witness. The investigation moved to pursue the soldier connection through formal identity parade proceedings. P.C. Barrett was taken to the Tower of London, where the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards was stationed, to attempt to identify the soldier he had observed in Wentworth Street at 2:00 in the morning. At the identity parade at the Tower, Barrett initially selected a man named John Leary. He then altered his identification and selected a different man. Both men had alibis that were verified by the regiment. Barrett's inconsistent identification at the Tower parade significantly weakened that line of inquiry and was noted in subsequent police reports as a point of difficulty. Connolly was taken to Wellington Barracks in Westminster, where the Coldstream Guards were stationed, for a separate set of identity parade proceedings. At the first parade, she declined to identify anyone at all. At a second parade conducted at Wellington Barracks, she identified two men, a Corporal Benjamin, also recorded in some contemporary accounts as Corporal Bennett, and a private named Skipper. Both men, upon investigation, had alibis that were confirmed by fellow soldiers and by the regiment. Neither could be placed at George Yard on the night of the 6th. The identity parades at both barracks had thus produced no actionable result, and the investigation of soldiers as the principal suspects was effectively exhausted by the middle of August 1888. Inspector Reed continued to direct inquiries into other possible lines of investigation, but the documentary record does not reveal any further substantive leads developed after the failure of the identity parade proceedings. The investigation was conducted with the resources available to a divisional CID in a busy inner London district, and those resources were not unlimited. The structural barriers to resolution were considerable. The witnesses from Martha's community had limited reason to trust or assist the police. The single most material witness in Connolly had been evasive from the outset, and the only firm physical evidence pointing to a suspect was a set of inconsistent identifications at two sets of military parades, both of which had produced men with verified alibis. The investigation had, by the third week of August 1888, produced no suspect against whom a charge could be laid. The identity of the man who had entered George Yard with Martha Tabram in the early minutes of the 7th of August remained unestablished. The record of the inquiry was placed before the coroner's inquest, which would consider the evidence formally and return a verdict. A post-mortem examination was conducted at the mortuary by Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen. The examination was thorough, and its findings were entered into the formal record. Dr. Killeen determined the cause of death to be hemorrhage resulting from multiple stab wounds. The number of stab wounds to the body of Martha Tabram was 39. The wounds were distributed across a wide range of anatomical sites, including the throat, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the spleen, the stomach, and the lower abdomen. Several of the individual wounds to vital organs, including the heart, lungs, liver, and spleen, would each have been independently capable of causing death. The concentration of wounds across such a range of sites indicated an attack of considerable duration and sustained force. Dr. Keeleen's examination produced a finding of particular significance regarding the instruments used. Of the 39 wounds he identified, 38 were consistent in their character with a short-bladed instrument, such as a penknife or pocket knife. The cuts were of a depth and width consistent with a blade of limited length. The 39th wound was located at the sternum, the breastbone at the centre of the chest, and was of a substantially different character. This wound was deeper, wider, and had required a greater degree of force to inflict. Dr. Killeen testified that this wound was consistent with a longer, heavier, and stronger blade, and that in his professional opinion, it may have been inflicted with a bayonet or with a long-bladed surgical instrument such as a post-mortem knife. The distinction between the two classes of wound was significant, as it indicated the use of two separate instruments during the course of the attack. Whether this indicated the presence of two separate assailants, each employing a different weapon, or a single assailant who had employed two instruments, was a question that the physical evidence could not resolve, and Dr. Killeen did not reach a conclusion on that point in his testimony. The time of death was estimated by Dr. Killeen on the basis of the temperature of the body and the condition of the blood pooled beneath it, as falling within a window of approximately 2 o'clock in the morning to 4:45 on the morning of the 7th. This estimate placed the death within the period following Mahoney's passage of the landing at 1:45, and before Reeves's discovery at approximately 4:45. Crow's account of seeing a figure on the landing at 3:30 fell within this window, but did not resolve the question of whether Martha was living or dead at that point. Dr. Keeleen's findings were entered into the official record and presented in full at the inquest proceedings. These medical findings form the evidentiary foundation of the inquiry. The two-weapon finding, in particular, attracted sustained attention from the investigation and the press in the days that followed the post-mortem. The bayonet as a potential weapon reinforced the soldier connection that the rest of the evidence had already suggested. It also introduced the possibility of a surgical instrument, which pointed in a different direction entirely. The examination had established with precision how Martha Tabram had died. It had done nothing to establish by whose hand. The coroner's inquest into the death of Martha Tabram was convened at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, Whitechapel. The proceedings were presided over by George Collier, the Deputy Coroner for the South Eastern Division of Middlesex. The inquest opened on the 9th of August, 1888, 2 days after the discovery of the body, and continued over a series of hearings before concluding on the 23rd of August, 1888. A jury was empanelled to hear the evidence and return a verdict. John Saunders Reeves gave testimony regarding the circumstances of his discovery of the body on the morning of the 7th. He described ascending the staircase of George Yard buildings at approximately 4:45 in the morning, finding the woman on the first floor landing, and immediately going to find a police officer. His account was consistent across the inquest proceedings and was not materially challenged. P.C. Thomas Barrett gave testimony regarding his patrol in the early hours of the 7th of August. The encounter he had observed between Martha and a soldier as they entered George Yard at approximately 1:15 midnight, and his separate encounter at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning with a Grenadier Guard standing in Wentworth Street at the Whitechapel High Street end of the passage. Barrett also gave testimony regarding the identity parade proceedings at the Tower of London and the outcome of those proceedings, including the inconsistency in his identifications. Barrett was examined on these points by the coroner and the inquest jury. His account of the 2 o'clock encounter was accepted as testimony of what he had observed, while the identity parade failure was noted as leaving the question of that soldier's identity unresolved. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen gave full testimony regarding the post-mortem examination, the cause of death, the number and distribution of the 39 stab wounds, and the identification of 2 distinct classes of wound, consistent with 2 separate instruments. Killeen's testimony regarding the one wound at the sternum and its consistency with a bayonet or long-bladed surgical instrument attracted particular attention from the coroner and from the press reports of the proceedings. He was questioned on the matter of whether the weapon might have been a surgical instrument rather than a military blade, and he acknowledged that both interpretations were consistent with the wound as he had observed it. Henry Turner gave testimony identifying the body and describing the nature and duration of his cohabitation with Martha, as well as the circumstances of their separation. Henry Samuel Tabram also gave testimony, confirming the history of the marriage and its breakdown, the maintenance arrangement, and its subsequent reduction. Both men provided the inquest with an account of Martha's circumstances and history that was consistent in its principal outlines. Joseph Mahoney and Alfred George Crowe gave testimony regarding what each had observed, or failed to observe, on the first floor landing during the night of the 6th and the early hours of the 7th. Mahoney confirmed that he and his wife had passed the landing at approximately 1:45 and had encountered nothing. Crowe confirmed his observation of a figure at approximately 3:30 and his decision not to investigate further. These 2 accounts frame the time of death question without resolving it. Mary Ann Connolly, Pearly Pole, gave evidence regarding the evening of the 6th of August, the drinking at the White Swan and the other public houses in the area, the company of the 2 soldiers, and the separation at George Yard at approximately 1:15 midnight. Her evidence described what she had witnessed during the hours in which she and Martha had been together, and the manner in which they had parted. Connolly had been difficult to locate in the initial stages of the investigation and had not presented herself to the police promptly. Her testimony at the inquest was complicated by her initial evasiveness and by the failure of her identifications at the 2 identity parade proceedings at Wellington Barracks. She was characterised in press accounts of the inquest proceedings as an unreliable witness. The inquest jury heard her evidence and weighed it accordingly. On the 23rd of August, 1888, the jury returned its verdict. The verdict was willful murder against some person or persons unknown. No committal to trial resulted from the inquest proceedings. No individual had been identified against whom a charge could be laid, and the inquest verdict reflected the state of the evidence as it stood. the coroner formally recorded the proceedings, and the case passed to the archive of unresolved inquiries maintained by H Division and the Metropolitan Police. The inquest had placed on formal record the medical findings, the witness testimony, and the investigative work conducted by H Division in the weeks preceding the verdict. The case had produced a detailed evidentiary record, properly gathered, formally examined, and duly returned as unresolved. Press coverage of the case was extensive in the days following the discovery of the body on the 7th of August and through the period of the inquest proceedings. The Star, the East London Observer, and the Times each reported on the discovery and the inquest. The East London Observer covered the inquest hearings in considerable detail, reproducing portions of the witness testimony and Dr. Killeen's medical findings. The Times carried shorter accounts of the proceedings. The Star, founded in 1888 by T.P. O'Connor and already establishing itself as a newspaper oriented towards sensational crime coverage, reported on the case with particular attention to the soldier angle and the identity parade proceedings at the Tower of London and Wellington Barracks. Press commentary in the days following the discovery noted several features of the case that were considered remarkable. The number of wounds, 39, was a figure that attracted sustained attention in the coverage, with several newspapers noting that it matched the age of the victim. The fact that none of the residents of George Yard buildings had heard any disturbance during the night was remarked upon as extraordinary, and various explanations were offered, including the suggestion that the attack had occurred with unusual speed, or that the victim had been rendered insensible quickly and had therefore been unable to make any sound. The soldier connection, with its implied link to the military garrison at the nearby Tower of London, attracted particular interest from readers in the district and from the press beyond it. Coverage of the identity parade failure at the Tower, and subsequently at Wellington Barracks, was carried in detail, and press accounts were critical of the evidentiary outcome without being critical of the investigating officers in specific terms. The coverage that had accumulated around the case of Martha Tabram was brought to a relatively abrupt end by events in the same district 24 days after her death. On the 31st of August, 1888, the body of a woman named Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, not far from George Yard. Nichols had been killed by throat cutting and had sustained post-mortem abdominal wounds of a character that differed substantially from the stab wounds on Martha Tabram's body. The discovery of Nichols was followed in short order by the discovery of Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street on the 8th of September. The pattern that emerged across these subsequent deaths and the attention of the Metropolitan Police, the press and the public that attached to them, redirected the focus of investigative effort, public concern and journalistic resource from the George Yard case to what would become known as the Whitechapel murders. Martha Tabram's case did not disappear from the record, but it ceased to be the subject of active press interest in the months that followed. Inspector Edmund Reed, who had directed the investigation into Martha's death, continued in his role at H Division through the autumn of 1888, during which he was one of the divisional officers dealing with the subsequent murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. Reed regarded the George Yard murder as the first in the series of events that had overtaken his division during that year. He spoke and wrote of it in those terms in the years following his retirement from the Metropolitan Police in 1896, and his view that the George Yard case stood at the beginning of the Whitechapel horror was consistent across his later public statements. The question of the relationship between the murder of Martha Tabram and the subsequent series of murders attributed to Jack the Ripper became the central contested element of her case in the years and decades that followed. It has remained contested in the scholarly and investigative literature from the late Victorian period to the present day, and it requires direct treatment in any account of Martha Tabram's case and its legacy. The arguments advanced in favour of attributing Martha Tabram's murder to the Ripper rested on several grounds. The victim profile was consistent. Martha was a woman engaged in prostitution, alone in the street in the early hours of the morning, in the Whitechapel district. The location was within the geography of the subsequent murders. The level of violence was extreme. Detective Constable Walter Dew who served in H Division in 1888 and was personally familiar with the case at the time, wrote in his 1938 memoir that there could be no doubt that the August Bank Holiday murder was the handiwork of the Ripper. Dew's memoir, published 50 years after the events he described, is a retrospective account rather than a contemporary document. And the 50-year remove between the events and their recording is a consideration that must attach to his statement as a source. Nevertheless, Dew had been present in the division during the relevant period, and his professional recollection is not without weight. Chief Inspector Frederick George Aberline, who led the Ripper investigation from October 1888 onwards and was the most senior detective associated with the canonical series, is cited in Ripper literature as having referred to George Yard as the site where the first murder was committed. This attribution appears in accounts of interviews Aberline gave to the press following his retirement, though the precise primary source document for the statement has not been uniformly identified across the scholarly literature, and its citation should be understood as carrying medium rather than high confidence. If accurate, it represents the view of the officer who knew the canonical murders most intimately. The arguments advanced against attribution to the Ripper rested on grounds that many researchers have considered more methodologically rigorous. The canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, established through the investigative work of the Metropolitan Police and confirmed in the Ripper literature across more than a century of scholarship, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, murdered between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, 1888. All 5 were killed by throat cutting. All 5 sustained post-mortem wounds involving abdominal mutilation, which became increasingly severe and elaborate across the series. The method of killing that characterized the canonical murders was specific and consistent. The throat was cut, death followed, and the abdominal mutilation was inflicted after death. Martha Tabram was not killed by throat cutting. She was not subjected to abdominal mutilation in the manner that characterized the subsequent victims. She was stabbed 39 times by what the medical examination determined were 2 separate instruments. The method of attack was substantially different from the method that defines the canonical series. Philip Sugden, whose study of the Whitechapel murders is widely regarded in the scholarly literature as one of the most rigorously evidenced accounts, argued that consistency of method is the most reliable criterion for attribution in a case of this kind, and on that criterion placed Martha's murder outside the canonical series. The reasoning is straightforward. If a series is defined by a consistent method of killing, then a death that does not share that method should not be incorporated into the series simply on the grounds of geographic proximity, victim profile, or retrospective assertion by officers who were not directly investigating the murder. The argument from method is not conclusive in a formal sense, but it is the argument that the majority of careful scholarly treatments have found most persuasive. A further consideration involves the weapon evidence. Dr. Killian's finding that one wound was consistent with a bayonet or heavy military blade points, if accurate, to a weapon not associated with any of the subsequent Ripper murders, in which a knife or short-bladed instrument was consistently the identified weapon. The soldier connection in Martha's case, reinforced by the presence of soldiers with Martha on the evening of the 6th and P.C. Barrett's observation of a Grenadier Guard near George Yard at 2 o'clock in the morning, pointed toward a perpetrator with a military association. The investigation of that connection, though it produced no conviction, was not pursued without reason. The Metropolitan Police's own administrative treatment of the case is a further point of note. The files maintained by the Metropolitan Police on the Whitechapel murders, preserved in the MEPO 3 series at the National Archives at Kew, do not formally incorporate Martha Tabram's case into the Whitechapel murders file in the same manner as the canonical 5. The administrative distinction has been debated among researchers, and its significance is disputed, but it is consistent with a view held within the Metropolitan Police during the relevant period that Martha's murder was not necessarily connected to the subsequent series. The current state of scholarly opinion on the question of Ripper attribution is accurately described as contested, and it is likely to remain so in the absence of new primary evidence. The case for attribution rests primarily on circumstantial similarity of victim profile, location, and the retrospective views of officers who were familiar with both the George Yard murder and the canonical series. The case against attribution rests primarily on the difference in method and the absence of post-mortem mutilation. Neither position is capable of definitive proof on the evidence as it now stands. What can be stated with confidence is that the murder of Martha Tabram on the 7th of August, 1888, preceded by 24 days the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, that both murders occurred in the same district of East London, and that the investigation into Martha's death formed part of the institutional and procedural context within which H Division would be required to respond to the subsequent murders. Whether the same hand was responsible for both deaths is a question that the record cannot answer. The 24 days between the 7th of August and the 31st represent the interval within which Martha Tabram's case occupied the full attention of H Division and the East End press as a murder inquiry standing on its own terms. In the weeks following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols on the 31st, and in the months of intensifying public and investigative attention that followed through the autumn of 1888, Martha's case was gradually absorbed into the larger narrative of the Whitechapel murders rather than examined as a matter in its own right. This absorption has shaped the manner in which she has been remembered ever since. Martha Tabram's case entered the cultural record almost entirely through her incorporation into the literature and documentary tradition that grew up around the Jack the Ripper murders. She appears in the majority of book-length studies of the Whitechapel murders published across the 20th century and into the 21st. Donald Rumbelow's account, first published in 1975 and revised across subsequent editions, addressed Martha's case in its chronological treatment of the murders and established her as a standard point of reference for any narrative of the period beginning in August 1888. Martin Fido's study of 1987 and Paul Begg's subsequent work in 2004 both gave her case thorough treatment within their respective accounts of the series. Philip Sugden's study, published in 1994 and revised in 2002, provided what is widely regarded as the most carefully documented account of her death and its investigative aftermath. Walter Dew's memoir, published in 1938 under the title I Caught Crippen, gave readers a personal recollection of the George Yard murder from a detective constable who had served in H Division during the relevant period. Dew's celebrity derived principally from his later arrest of the poisoner Hawley Harvey Crippen in 1910, and his memoir's treatment of the Whitechapel period drew on that association to bring the events of 1888 before a reading public 50 years removed from them. His assertion that the August bank holiday murder was the handiwork of the Ripper was made by a man who had been on the ground in Whitechapel at the time, though the retrospective character of the account is a limitation that any reader of his memoir must take into account. In the documentary and television tradition, Martha Tabram has appeared consistently as the opening figure in productions addressing the Ripper murders, typically presented as a precursor or as the first victim, depending on the position adopted by the production on the attribution question. She has not been the sole subject of a long-form documentary production. Her name is known to anyone with a sustained interest in the Ripper case, and largely unknown to those without it. The historical legacy of Martha Tabram's case operates on two levels that are not easily separated. On the first level, her case stands as the record of the death of one woman in the East End of London in August 1888. A woman whose life had carried her from a Christmas Day marriage at Trinity Church in Newington to a common lodging house in Spitalfields over a period of 19 years. On the second level, her case operates as the threshold event of the most extensively documented criminal investigation in British history. The two levels are not equivalent in how they have been treated by the historical record. The physical geography associated with the case has been substantially transformed. George Yard was renamed Gunthorpe Street, and the passage survives as a physical location in Whitechapel today, though it bears little resemblance to the covered alley of 1888. George Yard Buildings, the block of model dwellings in which Martha's body was found, was demolished at some point in the 20th century, and no physical trace of the building, in its 1888 form, survives on the site. The street pattern in the immediate vicinity remains broadly consistent with its Victorian configuration, which has been of interest to those who investigate the geography of the Ripper murders in later decades. The Metropolitan Police files relating to Martha Tabram's case are held in the MEPO 3 series at the National Archives at Kew. These files include Inspector Reed's reports and the correspondence generated by the investigation, as well as the documentation of the Identity Parade proceedings at the Tower of London and Wellington Barracks. The files were progressively released to public access through the latter decades of the 20th century, consistent with the general opening of the Whitechapel murder files, and have been examined by researchers and historians since their release. The coroner's inquest record is a further primary source document. Contemporary newspaper coverage in the Star, the East London Observer, and the Times provides a contemporaneous account of the proceedings as they were understood and reported at the time. Inspector Edmund Reed left the Metropolitan Police in 1896 following a career in H Division that had spanned the most turbulent years of the Whitechapel investigations. He subsequently gave interviews to the press in which he reflected on the events of 1888 and the investigation that his division had been required to conduct. He described the George Yard murder consistently as the beginning of the series of events that had defined that year for his division. Reed settled in the East End following his retirement and was regarded in the community he had policed as a figure of some standing and local renown. His connection to the investigations of 1888 remained a point of public interest for the remainder of his life. Martha Tabram was buried in East London on the 14th of August, 1888, 1 week after her death. The burial was attended in the manner available to a woman of her circumstances and position. No account of the burial in the surviving record indicates that it was marked by any formal public ceremony or by the attendance of figures beyond those immediately connected to the proceedings. The social and economic conditions that placed Martha Tabram in George Yard on the night of the 6th of August, 1888, were not exceptional within the district in which she lived. They were representative. The East End of London in 1888 was receiving the sustained effects of an agricultural depression that had driven large-scale migration from rural England into the city through the preceding decade, compounding the pressure on housing, wages, and social services in the districts that absorbed the new arrivals. Eastern European Jewish immigration, driven by the pogroms in Russia and Poland through the 1880s, had brought a substantial new population into Whitechapel and Spitalfields, further intensifying the competition for accommodation and casual employment. The common lodging houses that charged 4p a night accommodated thousands of people across dozens of registered establishments in the parish of Whitechapel alone. The Metropolitan Police's own estimates of the number of women engaged in street prostitution in the district, placed at approximately 1,200 in 1888, were regarded at the time as conservative by some observers. The conditions in which Martha Tabram lived and died were the conditions of a district operating beyond the capacity of its infrastructure and without adequate public provision for the population it contained. The 1880s had also seen sustained public campaigning by reform organisations regarding the conditions of life in the East End and the particular vulnerability of women within those conditions. The Salvation Army was active in the district. Various social purity organisations had made the streets of Whitechapel a focus of moral and political attention. W.T. Stead's series of articles in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1885, published under the title The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, had brought questions of sexual exploitation and poverty before a national readership in terms that generated considerable public debate. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 became, in the press coverage that followed, a further occasion for that debate, with organisations arguing that the deaths of women like Martha Tabram were the predictable consequence of tolerating the conditions in which such women were required to live. The script of that argument, whatever its political purpose, did not serve to resolve those conditions or to protect the women living within them. The Metropolitan Police's capacity to investigate crimes in Whitechapel in 1888 was constrained by chronic underfunding and understaffing at the divisional level, by difficult relations with immigrant communities whose members had limited reason to assist or trust the police, and by the structural barriers that attended any investigation in a district with a large transient population whose members were often unknown to each other and to the authorities by name. The investigation into Martha Tabram's death was conducted by officers working under these constraints. Inspector Reed and his colleagues at H Division gathered the evidence that was available to them, pursued the leads that the evidence suggested, and conducted the identity parade proceedings with appropriate procedural care. The failure to identify a perpetrator was not a failure of investigative effort. It was the outcome of an investigation conducted in difficult circumstances against an unknown individual who left no material trace that survived the night. The resignation of Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren in November 1888, driven in significant part by the public and political pressure generated by the Whitechapel murders, resulted in institutional changes within the Metropolitan Police that altered the command structure and some investigative procedures of the force. These changes unfolded after the active investigation into Martha Tabram's death had concluded, and their direct bearing on her case was limited. Their indirect bearing, in establishing the institutional context within which the investigation had operated, is part of the broader record of which her case forms a component. Martha Tabram's two sons, born during the years of her marriage to Henry Tabram, do not appear in the surviving record relevant to this case, beyond their acknowledgement in the testimony of Henry Tabram at the inquest. Their names are not documented in the case files. Their subsequent lives are not part of the record. Henry Samuel Tabram, the estranged husband who gave testimony at the inquest and who had continued to pay a reduced maintenance allowance to Martha after their separation, does not appear in the record following his inquest testimony. Henry Turner, who had cohabited with Martha from approximately 1876 until shortly before her death, and who identified her body at the mortuary, similarly disappears from the documentary record relevant to this case after fulfilling his role in the identification and inquest proceedings. Mary Ann Connolly, Pearlie Poll, whose evidence at the inquest had been treated with considerable reservation by the proceedings, returned to the streets and lodging houses of Whitechapel. She does not appear in the subsequent record of the Ripper investigation as a materially important figure, having exhausted the contribution she was able to make at the identity parade proceedings in August 1888. The building in which Martha Tabram died no longer stands. The passage in which the building stood has been renamed. The public houses in which she spent her final evening have not survived in their 1888 form. The district itself has been substantially transformed by development, demolition, and the movement of populations over the century, and more that has elapsed since the events described in this account. The physical world in which Martha Tabram lived and died exists now only in the documentary record, in the inquest transcripts, in the Metropolitan Police files held at Kew, in the newspaper accounts of the Star and the East London Observer and the Times, and in the scholarship that has drawn upon those sources to reconstruct what can be established about the case. The coroner's inquest of August 1888 returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. That verdict has stood without amendment or revision for more than 100 years. No subsequent proceeding has altered it, and no evidence has emerged to change the substance of what the inquest record contains. Martha Tabram was 39 years old. She'd been born in Southwark in May of 1849 and had spent the whole of her life within the working-class districts of South and East London. She was buried in the East End of London on the 14th of August, 1888, a week after her death. The circumstances of the night of the 6th of August and the identity of the person who killed her have not been determined by any formal proceeding or by any body of evidence capable of bearing the weight of a conclusion. The case of Martha Tabram closes the record examined here. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. The identity parade as an investigative instrument in 1888 operated under conditions and conventions substantially different from the procedures that would later be formalised in British policing practice. There was no formal statutory regulation of identity parade proceedings in the Metropolitan Police at that date, and the procedures followed at the Tower of London and at Wellington Barracks in August 1888 were conducted according to the practical judgment of the officers present rather than against a codified standard. P.C. Barrett's experience at the Tower Parade, in which he selected one man and then altered his identification to select another, and in which both selected men were subsequently found to have alibis, illustrates the fragility of visual identification evidence gathered under the conditions available to the investigation. Barrett had encountered the soldier he was asked to identify in darkness at 2 o'clock in the morning during a brief exchange in a street without any expectation that he would be required to identify the man again in formal proceedings. The limitations on the evidential value of his identification, given those circumstances, were apparent at the time and were noted in the press reporting of the inquest. The coroner's inquest itself, as an institution of Victorian legal procedure, served a function distinct from that of a criminal trial. The inquest was not designed to establish guilt and impose punishment. Its statutory purpose was to determine the identity of the deceased, the cause of death, and, where relevant, the manner in which death had been brought about. The jury at a coroner's inquest was empowered to name a suspect in its verdict if the evidence supported such a naming, and in cases where a named suspect was returned, the matter would proceed to a magistrate's court and potentially to trial at the Central Criminal Court or the relevant assize. In Martha Tabram's case, the evidence did not support the naming of any individual, and the verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown was the outcome appropriate to the state of the evidence as it stood before the jury. The verdict was neither an admission of investigative failure nor a closing of the inquiry in any formal legal sense. It was an accurate return on the evidence available to the inquest, and it reflected the limits of what that evidence could establish. The two-weapon finding produced by Dr. Killeen's post-mortem examination continued to be a point of investigative consideration beyond the immediate inquest proceedings. The question it raised, whether two instruments indicated the presence of two persons, or whether a single individual had carried and used two different blades in the course of the attack, was one that the physical evidence alone could not resolve. The investigators gave consideration to both possibilities. The presence of two soldiers, with Martha on the evening of the 6th, and the separation into pairs at George Yard, with only one soldier accompanying Martha into the passage, meant that the two-person hypothesis would have required a second individual to have been present at the scene without Connolly's knowledge or observation. The single assailant hypothesis, by contrast, required accepting that one individual had carried both a penknife and a substantially larger blade, and had used both in the course of inflicting 39 wounds. Neither interpretation was impossible. The investigation did not reach a formal conclusion on the point, and Dr. Killeen's testimony was careful to present the finding as observation rather than determination. The specific character of the East End's relationship with the military garrison at the Tower of London in 1888 provided a context within which soldiers in public houses along Whitechapel High Street were a thoroughly familiar presence. The Tower garrison drew men from various regiments on rotation, and those men moved through the public houses and streets of the surrounding district during their off-duty hours as a matter of course. The presence of two soldiers in the company of Martha and Connolly on the evening of the 6th was neither unusual nor remarkable within the social patterns of the district. The landlords and landladies of public houses along the High Street knew the custom of the garrison well. That Martha and Connolly had found companions for the evening at the White Swan or in the vicinity was entirely consistent with the routine social patterns of the district and the holiday. The question of what occurred in George Yard after the separation at midnight has never been answered by the record. The covered passage was narrow, poorly lit, and largely isolated from the street traffic of Whitechapel High Street by the archway at its entrance. It was not a place where any resident or passerby would have occasion to linger without purpose. The first-floor landing of George Yard buildings, reached by the internal communal staircase, was accessible to anyone who entered the building through its ground-floor entrance, but was not visible from the passage or from the street. The building's residents use the staircase at various hours of the night as a matter of routine. The fact that no resident who passed the landing during the night reported hearing a disturbance of any kind is a feature of the case that the inquest noted, but did not explain. Dr. Killeen's evidence did not address the question of how long the attack had lasted or whether it would have produced sounds audible beyond the immediate space of the landing. That question, like the identity of the perpetrator and the precise time of death, remained outside the boundary of what the evidence could establish. The case of Martha Tabram closes the record examined here. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete.